He was broken, forgotten, and left to drown more than 130 miles from shore. But when a lone man pulled his fragile body from the sea, neither of them knew they were saving each other. This is more than just a story of rescue. It's about healing, faith, and the quiet bond that only God could have written into their fates. Stay tuned, because what this dog does next will touch your soul. Leave a quick comment and let me know. You matter here. Hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear will restore your faith in something. Thank you very much. A soft breeze stirred the calm waters off the eastern coast of Savannah, Georgia, as the sky melted from dawn into pale daylight. It was the kind of spring morning that wrapped the Atlantic Ocean in a deceptive stillness, the kind of day when the sea whispered rather than roared. The air carried the scent of salt and something older, something almost forgotten. Seagulls circled overhead, their cries distant, and fog clung low on the horizon like breath not yet exhaled. Cutting through the water with a steady, measured hum was a small fishing boat, once white but long since faded to a weather-beaten gray. Her name, barely legible now, was etched in chipped paint on the hull, Maureen's Echo. At the wheel stood Caleb Dawson, a man whose posture suggested both strength and exhaustion. 52 years old, Caleb was tall and lean, with wide shoulders shaped by years of manual labor and a lifetime spent navigating chaos both at sea and in war. His skin was darkened by sun and wind, textured like old leather. His eyes, steel gray and often unreadable, saw the world with a quiet caution. A shaggy beard framed his square jaw, while his black hair, streaked with silver, was tied back at the nape of his neck. He wore a thick canvas coat over a faded t-shirt, loose cargo pants, and boots scuffed from years of use. His movements were slow but deliberate, always efficient, as if he had no patience left for wasted effort. Caleb was a former Navy K-9 handler, retired over a decade ago after deployments he never spoke about. The war had left him with scars not visible to the eye, but it was the death of his wife, Maureen, 5 years ago from ovarian cancer that carved the deepest wounds. Since her passing, Caleb had retreated from the world, choosing the company of the sea over people. The boat had been Maureen's favorite place. He renamed it for her after she died and rarely returned to the mainland except for supplies and fuel. This morning, like so many before it, he was seeking solitude more than fish. The ocean was the only place that didn't expect things from him, the only place that didn't ask him to explain the sadness he wore like a second skin. He sipped from a dented metal thermos, the coffee inside lukewarm and bitter, when a strange shape caught his eye just off the port bow. It bobbed awkwardly in the water, distant but moving against the current. At first, he thought it might be driftwood. That was common enough, especially after storms. But this thing had a rhythm, an erratic persistence that didn't match the idle movement of debris. Caleb narrowed his eyes, leaned forward, then grabbed the binoculars hanging on a hook near the wheel. He brought them up to his face and adjusted the focus. What he saw made his heart hitch. A dog. Not just any dog, but a large German shepherd, barely staying afloat, paddling with jerky, uneven motions. Its body was skeletal, fur clumped and heavy with seawater. Every few seconds, it dipped beneath the surface, only to resurface again with visible strain. Its snout barely cleared the waves. The dog looked like it had been out there for hours, maybe longer. Jesus, Caleb muttered under his breath, already turning the wheel sharply and throttling the engine. The boat surged forward, cutting through the water toward the animal. He could feel adrenaline coiling in his chest like a spring. The dog didn't react to the sound of the engine or Caleb's voice when he called out. It just kept swimming, or trying to. When the boat was close enough, Caleb killed the engine and grabbed the rope ladder. With practiced movements, he shed his coat, kicked off his boots, and lowered himself into the water. The cold was immediate and punishing, soaking through his clothes like ice. He forced his body forward, eyes locked on the dog. Closer now, he could see that one of the shepherd's hind legs was dragging uselessly behind it. The other 3 limbs paddled in exhaustion. Its ears were flat, its eyes glazed. When Caleb reached it, he wrapped one arm around the dog's chest and pulled it close. The dog didn't resist. It couldn't. Its body sagged in his arms, too far gone to fight. Caleb kicked toward the boat, grunting with the effort. He pushed the animal upward and onto the ladder's lowest rung. By instinct or miracle, the shepherd clawed weakly and dragged itself onto the deck, collapsing in a shaking heap. Caleb followed, drenched and gasping, and knelt beside the animal. The dog was male, probably around 4 or 5 years old based on the wear in his teeth and the maturity in his features. His coat was once a deep black and tan, but now it clung in patchy wet mats to a gaunt frame. His paws were raw and bloodied from hours of swimming, and his breathing was rapid, shallow. There was no collar around his neck, only a faint indentation where one may have once been. Caleb noticed something glinting beneath the fur, just near the dog's shoulder. He carefully pried it loose. It was a small, rusted fragment of metal, barely the size of a key fob. On one side, the engraving had nearly worn away with time and salt, but one letter remained etched into the corroded surface. M. Caleb wrapped the dog in a dry tarp and placed a bowl of fresh water beside him, though the shepherd didn't move. He sat down next to the animal, running a rough hand through his hair. The sea stretched endlessly in every direction, empty and indifferent. But something had changed now. The boat, once a vessel of retreat, now held 2 survivors. "You shouldn't be alive," Caleb whispered. "But somehow you are." He looked into the dog's eyes, those amber, storm-washed eyes, and saw not panic, not confusion, but the raw glimmer of survival. "You've seen things, haven't you?" he added, almost to himself. "So have I." The shepherd closed his eyes for the first time since coming aboard. Caleb leaned back against the side of the cabin, drenched and cold, but unable to look away from the creature that had drifted out of nowhere and disrupted the silence he had held sacred. He didn't know where the dog came from, or how he had ended up 140 miles from land with no sign of a vessel, no beacon, no life vest. All he knew was this: he hadn't found a dog. He'd found a question. And for the first time in 5 years, Caleb Dawson was willing to search for an answer. The Georgia sun had climbed higher by the time Caleb Dawson brought Maureen's Echo back to the dock. The marina was quiet as ever, framed by gray piers and peeling white boathouses that had weathered decades of salt and time. The only movement was the occasional sway of tide boats and the gentle creak of ropes pulling against cleats. The tide was low, and a briny wind moved through the reeds along the shoreline. Caleb lifted the still-soaked German shepherd into his arms. The dog's fur had begun to dry in coarse patches, revealing the gaunt shape of his body, ribs pressing against skin, eyes sunken but faintly alert. Caleb cradled him with care, the way he might have once carried his son as a toddler, back when the world still felt whole. He didn't know why this dog had gotten under his skin so fast. Perhaps it was the quiet, dignified way the animal endured. No whining, no barking, just that haunted, deliberate silence. Caleb stepped off the boat and into his truck, an old forest green Dodge Ram with chipped paint and a spiderwebbed crack in the windshield. The passenger seat had a wool blanket folded neatly in it, Maureen's old car blanket from years ago. He laid the dog down gently. "I'm calling you Shadow," he muttered as he started the ignition. "Don't ask me why. It just fits." The dog didn't stir. As Caleb drove along the winding back roads that led toward the outskirts of Savannah, the landscape blurred into a stretch of palmetto trees, crumbling shacks, and roadside stands selling boiled peanuts and firewood. The silence in the truck was thick, and Caleb's mind drifted to a time that had been buried but never forgotten. Nathaniel, his boy, 19 when he enlisted, against Caleb's wishes, said he wanted to serve, wanted to be like Dad. Caleb had tried to talk him out of it, told him the world didn't need more broken men coming home in pieces. But Nathaniel had that same stubborn streak. Maureen called it a Dawson curse. The IED in Fallujah had torn the boy's vehicle apart. Only one body recovered in full. Caleb never even got a last phone call. Just a knock on the door and a folded flag. Since then, he hadn't allowed himself to care for anything too fragile. Not people, not pets, not promises. Until now. The veterinary clinic Caleb chose wasn't the biggest or the fanciest, but it was quiet and unassuming, like the people who went there didn't need judgment, just help. The sign outside was hand-painted and read Riverbend Animal Hospital. It sat tucked beneath a canopy of moss-laden oaks, a one-story brick building with white trim, and a gravel parking lot. Caleb parked under the shade and turned to Shadow, who had begun to shiver again, weak but alive. He lifted the dog in his arms and carried him inside. Behind the front desk was a woman in her early 40s, dressed in deep blue scrubs with a small embroidered paw on the chest. She was tall and broad-shouldered with blonde hair tied in a thick braid that hung down her back. Her name tag read Trudy. Trudy Simmons was the kind of person who made fast judgments but rarely voiced them. Years of working as a vet tech had honed her into someone who could keep her composure in any crisis, though she still wore grief in small, invisible ways. Her husband had been killed during a convenience store robbery 10 years earlier, and since then, she'd poured herself into work, animals being far easier to trust than humans. Trudy looked up at Caleb and the dog in his arms. Her face didn't shift much, but her eyes registered immediate concern. "Emergency?" she asked simply. Caleb nodded. "Found him out at sea, over 100 miles out. No tag, no chip, barely breathing." She didn't blink. "Room 3. I'll get Dr. Reese." Inside the exam room, Caleb gently laid Shadow on a padded table. The lights were low, and a slow jazz tune played faintly from a speaker in the ceiling. Trudy returned a moment later with a man in his late 50s following behind her. Dr. Charles Reese was short and stout with a round belly, and the kind of deeply tanned skin that suggested years spent on boats or farms. His white coat was stained at the cuffs, and his glasses perched permanently at the edge of his nose. He moved with a quiet patience, like someone who had seen everything twice and didn't expect surprises anymore. "What do we have?" he asked in a gravelly voice. Caleb gave the rundown: the location, the condition, the absence of a collar. Dr. Reese ran his hands gently over the shepherd, checking gums, heartbeat, joints. "Dehydrated, obviously," he said. "Severe fatigue. Muscle strain. Paw pads are torn up, but no open wounds or fractures. Miraculous, really." Trudy scanned the dog for a microchip. Nothing. She tried again. Still nothing. "I found this stuck in his fur," Caleb said, fishing into his jacket pocket and pulling out the rusted piece of metal. He handed it to Dr. Reese, who examined it with narrowed eyes. "Just the letter M," the doctor murmured. "Could have been a tag. Military? Maybe. Could have been something else entirely." "Doesn't feel like a stray," Caleb said. "He's calm. Watchful. Like he's been trained." Dr. Reese nodded. "Wouldn't surprise me. Dogs like this aren't common. You can see it in the way they hold tension. They're never really relaxed. Always scanning." Trudy brought in a heated blanket, tucking it carefully around Shadow. She offered Caleb a cup of black coffee from a small pot in the corner, and he accepted without a word. "Leave him with us overnight," Dr. Reese said. "We'll stabilize him, start some fluids, run a tox screen just in case. If he makes it through the night, you'll be the first to know." "I'm not going anywhere," Caleb replied. Dr. Reese gave him a look, half amusement, half respect, and left the room. Trudy lingered a moment longer, her hands resting on the table's edge. "You care about him already," she said softly. Caleb didn't look up. "Didn't plan to. Just happened." Trudy nodded. "It always does." She turned off the overhead light and left the room dim, only a soft lamp glowing near the corner. Caleb sat down on the bench beside the table and watched as Shadow breathed slowly under the blanket. His body trembled occasionally, but his eyes were half open now, dulled but not empty. Caleb leaned forward. "You hang on," he whispered. "Whatever you ran from, whatever dropped you in that ocean, I'll figure it out. I swear." Shadow didn't move. But for the first time, his eyes blinked, once slow, deliberate, as if acknowledging the voice. Morning sunlight slanted through the blinds of the examination room, casting long striped shadows across the tiled floor. The clinic was quiet at this hour, save for the occasional rustle of paper from the front desk and the muffled thump of a cat in one of the kennels knocking over its water bowl. Caleb Dawson hadn't slept much, but he hadn't moved either. He remained on the same wooden bench, elbows on his knees, fingers loosely laced together, watching the German shepherd named Shadow lying on the padded table across from him. The dog had improved overnight, color returning to his gums, heart rate steadier, but the stillness in his body wasn't weakness. It was watchfulness. Dr. Charles Reese returned just after 8, holding a small tablet and a styrofoam cup of what passed for coffee. He entered without fanfare, moving with a slow but grounded confidence. His lab coat looked freshly pressed, but his hair remained wild in a way that suggested he never owned a comb and didn't care to. "He's stable," the doctor said without preamble. "Vitals are holding. I want to keep him another 24 hours, but I'd say your boy's got grit." Caleb nodded, but said nothing. His eyes remained on the dog. "There's something else," Reese added, setting the tablet aside. "This shepherd, he doesn't react like a typical stray or abandoned pet. We ran basic stimulus response. Loud noises, sudden movement, bright flashes. No flinch, no panic. He's trained," Caleb muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Reese raised a brow. "That's what it looks like. Military or law enforcement, hard to say which. But it's not pet obedience training. He's got the kind of emotional suppression you don't see in house dogs. The only time he reacted sharply was when I made a sharp downward motion with my hand." Reese demonstrated the gesture, a closed fist brought down and outward. Caleb watched. Shadow, who had been lying still with his head on his paws, raised it slowly, ears perked, and without sound or hesitation sat up. "There," Reese said, gesturing toward him. "That's your sign." Caleb exhaled slowly. "That's an old tactical cue. From recon units. I've used it." Reese crossed his arms. "You said you used to work with K-9 units?" Caleb gave a short nod. "U.S. Navy. Retired a long time ago." "Well, then you know what that kind of training means. Someone put time into him. This dog was someone's asset." Shadow remained seated, his body relaxed but alert. It was the kind of calm that came from discipline, not trust. Caleb stepped closer, crouched down in front of him, and softly said, "Where did you come from, boy?" Shadow blinked once, slow and steady. Later that afternoon, after signing a temporary release form and receiving a small bag of medication from Trudy, Caleb loaded Shadow back into the truck. The sun was high, the spring air warm, and the town of Savannah bustled with weekend visitors. Couples holding hands along the waterfront, kids chasing pigeons, and trolleys clanging their bells as they carried tourists through history-laden streets. Caleb drove the long way home, avoiding town center. He didn't want the dog seen. His cabin sat 10 miles southeast of the city, nestled among the pines just off a gravel road that had once been a logging trail. He'd bought the land after Maureen died, built the structure himself. One floor, wraparound porch, no neighbors within shouting distance. Just the way he liked it, or at least he had. He pulled the truck under the covered lean-to beside the house and opened the passenger door. Shadow stepped out slowly, favoring his hind leg, but moving better than the day before. Caleb led him inside, guiding him to the worn quilt laid beside the fireplace. "You'll stay here," he said, pointing to the corner, "till we figure out who you were." Shadow lay down obediently, tail still and eyes scanning the cabin, as if cataloging every exit. That night, Caleb cooked a simple dinner, grilled chicken and rice, the kind Maureen used to insist on when he wasn't feeling well. He put a bowl down for Shadow, who sniffed, then began to eat with cautious, deliberate bites. Caleb poured himself a finger of bourbon, settled into the old leather chair near the window, and turned on the radio. A soft blues song crackled through the speakers. They sat like that for a while, one man and one dog, both broken in ways the world couldn't see. It was around midnight when the first sign of intrusion arrived. A pair of headlights flickered through the trees. Not bright, not close, but there, moving slowly down the gravel road. Caleb turned off the radio, stood, and stepped to the window. The truck had stopped just past the edge of the property, partially obscured by trees. He couldn't see the driver, but he recognized the model, a late-model black SUV. Government issue, or a convincing imitation. The vehicle didn't move for several minutes. Then, without a sound, it backed up and disappeared into the night. Caleb stayed at the window long after. Shadow had risen, alert beside him, ears tilted toward the door. He hadn't barked or whined. He simply watched. The next morning, while Caleb was chopping wood outside, a truck pulled into the drive. It was old, rust-colored, and driven by a woman in her 60s with a ball cap and mirrored sunglasses. Iris Gentry had been Caleb's nearest neighbor for years, if two people who lived 2 miles apart could be considered neighbors. She was a retired schoolteacher turned beekeeper, short and wiry, with skin like tree bark and a blunt, no-nonsense tone that came from decades of commanding classrooms. "Morning," she called, stepping out of her truck. "Heard you picked up a dog." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "You heard that from who?" "Post office lady. And Tommy from the hardware store. Says you brought in a soaked shepherd with half a tail and a stare like death." Caleb frowned. "Didn't tell anyone. Didn't need to. Word travels. You know how folks are around here." She peered past him toward the porch. Shadow stood there, watching her with careful eyes. Iris whistled low. "He's a good-looking one. But that's not a stray, is it?" "No," she folded her arms. "You think someone's looking for him?" "I think someone already found him," Caleb said quietly. "Twice last night. Same black SUV. No plates." Iris nodded slowly, gaze hardening. "Then you better watch yourself. And if you need anything, radio, signal flares, a shotgun, I've got plenty. Just don't let them come up that driveway without you knowing." Caleb nodded in thanks. He didn't say it out loud, but he knew it now. This wasn't just about a rescue. It was the beginning of something else. The next few days unfolded with a tense stillness around Caleb's cabin, like the quiet that settles before a summer storm. The black SUV didn't return, but its presence lingered in Caleb's mind like smoke from a long-burned fire. He had taken to walking the perimeter twice a day with Shadow by his side. The dog moved with greater ease now, his limp more subtle, strength returning to his frame. Still, there was a peculiar alertness to him, especially during moments when the sky vibrated with distant rotor blades. It was on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 days after the SUV sighting, that Caleb made a call he hadn't expected to make. He dug out an old flip phone, one of the few personal artifacts he had held onto from his naval days, and scrolled through the outdated contact list until he found the name. Turner, Eli. Eli Turner had served with Caleb 2 decades ago. Once a senior K-9 handler for a classified Marine reconnaissance program, Eli had since retired to a small ranch in northern Georgia where he bred and rehabilitated retired service dogs. He was in his late 50s now, broad-shouldered and thick through the chest, with a white beard that gave him the air of a mountain hermit and the sharp blue eyes of someone who didn't miss much. He rarely answered phone calls, but today, to Caleb's surprise, he picked up on the second ring. 2 days later, a dust-covered black pickup truck pulled up Caleb's gravel drive just before noon. Shadow, curled near the porch, stood immediately, ears up, tail still. Caleb stepped outside to meet the man climbing out of the truck. Eli wore dark jeans, a weathered brown flannel shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed most of his face. His beard had grown longer since Caleb had seen him last, but the firm line of his jaw and posture remained unchanged. "Still living like a ghost, I see," Eli grunted as they shook hands. "Still dressing like an off-duty grizzly," Caleb replied dryly. They both smiled, just a flicker, before Eli turned his gaze toward the dog. Shadow had taken a step forward, not with aggression, but with intense focus. The dog's head was slightly lowered, his front paw lifted mid-step. He was watching Eli's hands. "Is this him?" Eli asked, his voice lowering. Caleb nodded. "Found him swimming 140 miles offshore." Eli let out a slow whistle. "Well, damn. What kind of hell did you crawl out of, buddy?" Shadow remained frozen in place, gaze unbroken. Eli crouched slowly, speaking softly now. "Let's find out what you remember." He extended his right hand, fingers flattened, palm down, then slowly raised 2 fingers and moved them in a tight half-circle before lowering them sharply to the ground. Without hesitation, Shadow dropped to the earth, tail tucked slightly, head forward, paws extended in front of him like he'd been drilled to do it 100 times. He didn't look at Eli, he kept his eyes on Caleb, Combat prone, Eli said. Used in tactical search operations and marine drop zones. Only taught to Tier 2 military K9s. This dog's no civilian fluke. Caleb's jaw tightened. I figured. Eli stood, brushing dust from his knees. I'd say he's 4, maybe 5 years old. Prime working age. Good bone structure, classic German shepherd gait. You know what that means. They trained him. They lost him. And they're trying to get him back. Caleb glanced toward the edge of the woods. I don't think that SUV was a coincidence. Eli nodded grimly. You should assume they'll be back. As the two men spoke, a low vibration stirred the branches overhead. At first it was subtle, like distant thunder, but then the sound grew into a familiar chopping rhythm, the thump of helicopter rotors. Caleb's head snapped upward. No fly zone over this sector. Shadow tensed. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He didn't even whine. Instead, he crouched low, eyes sharp, tail rigid, and began to crawl toward the side of the cabin, moving like he was still in a war zone. His every muscle screamed muscle memory. His nose twitched. His body trembled. See that? Eli said, his tone suddenly tight. That's trigger memory. That sound is tied to trauma. The helicopter passed overhead, its shadow rippling over the clearing. Shadow froze beneath the eaves, panting shallowly, eyes unfocused for a split second, as if trapped in something no one else could see. Then the noise faded, the sky returning to silence. Shadow stood and looked toward the sky, his breathing beginning to even out. He's remembering, Eli muttered. Something big. Inside, over a pot of dark coffee and a kitchen table covered in newspaper clippings and old tactical notebooks, Eli offered more detail. There are some rumors, unconfirmed, but loud enough to catch my ear. About a program. Experimental K9 deployments. Not detection dogs. Not EODs. Full recon, ocean-capable, high-risk infiltration, satellite tagging missions. You think Shadow was part of that? Caleb asked, arms crossed, leaning against the counter. Based on how he dropped for that signal, I'd bet my truck. These dogs weren't just trained to obey. They were taught to think, adapt, improvise. Independent operators with handlers who were just as deep in. Caleb ran a hand through his hair. No wonder someone wants him back. You're damn right. Eli stood, stretching his back. And if you're keeping him here, you better be ready. These kinds of dogs don't go missing without someone up top noticing. And when black SUVs start circling, that's not coincidence. That's cleanup. That evening, after Eli had gone, Caleb sat on the porch with Shadow at his side. The dog rested his head on Caleb's boot, calm again, as the sun began to dip low over the trees. The world felt too still, as if it was holding its breath. Caleb looked down at the animal beside him and said, You were a soldier once, and now they want you back. But you've got a choice now, Shadow. Whatever they trained you to be, you don't belong to them anymore. The shepherd didn't react, but his breathing was slow, measured, peaceful, and above them, in the far-off sky, a faint thrum pulsed again, then disappeared. That night the wind rolled in off the marshes, cold and laced with the earthy scent of pine and brine. A low fog began to coil between the trees outside Caleb's cabin, swallowing sound and light until the forest became a wall of gray. Inside, the cabin was quiet. The only sound came from the gentle clinking of Caleb's spoon against his coffee mug and the rhythmic ticking of the clock above the fireplace. Shadow lay near the hearth, his eyes half closed but ears constantly flicking, picking up frequencies the human ear couldn't perceive. Caleb stared at the old laptop on the table. The machine had dust on its hinges, stickers long peeled away, and a faint hum that sounded like it might give out at any moment. It hadn't been opened in years. Not since Maureen passed. Not since he walked away from everything with a rank and silence the government had been content to keep quiet. He sipped the last of his coffee, pulled the chair back with a creak, and sat down. Shadow lifted his head slightly, but didn't move. Caleb opened the laptop. The screen flickered before stabilizing, the familiar Navy interface loading slowly. Beneath the login screen was a field of blue with a gold eagle insignia, one that hadn't been updated in over a decade. Caleb typed in a string of legacy codes, his fingers slow but sure. He paused only once, when prompted for a command passcode. That one, he remembered with bitter clarity. It had been created during his last mission briefing, under the authority of a program no one acknowledged existed. He typed it, Echo 07 Marauder. The screen blinked, then loaded. He navigated through a series of secured directories, digging deeper, bypassing outdated encryption. Most of the files had been locked behind redaction bars or marked as corrupted. But finally, in a subfolder labeled redacted_PS/offshore/2025Q1, he found something that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Asset M4 breed, German Shepherd assigned unit. Shadow Recon Atlantic Experimental Division role. Deep Sea Reconnaissance/Independent Navigation/Object Tracking Handler. Classified status. Deployed offshore mission Alpha Greyline last signal received. 72 hours prior current status. Presumed lost at SEA, no recovery ordered. Caleb leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. No recovery ordered. That was the line that chilled him most. Not missing in action. Not search initiated. No recovery. As if the dog hadn't just been lost, but deliberately written off. He clicked further, but every subsequent link was blocked. A red warning flashed on the screen. Clearance override required protocol Tier 4 log attempt recorded. Caleb quickly closed the file, powered off the laptop, and pulled the battery. He wasn't sure who monitored the database anymore. But if the SUV and the helicopter meant anything, someone knew this shepherd, Shadow, was still alive. And they weren't happy about it. He turned toward the hearth. Shadow had risen and now stood at full attention, staring at Caleb as if he'd been reading every word over his shoulder. The dog didn't move, didn't blink, just watched. Your asset M4, Caleb said under his breath. They trained you to go places most humans couldn't survive. You weren't a pet. You were a tool. But that wasn't what disturbed Caleb the most. It was the handler field, marked as classified. Every K9 had a handler. Always. To redact that information meant something far worse than protocol. It meant concealment. Later that night, Caleb sat out on the porch, bundled in Maureen's old fleece jacket, his breath visible in the cold. He looked out over the tree line, thoughts heavy. He couldn't shake the question forming in the back of his mind. Had Shadow been abandoned, or was he meant to die out there? The door creaked open behind him. Shadow stepped out, slow and silent. He walked past Caleb, stood at the edge of the porch, and looked up at the stars. After a long pause, he laid down at Caleb's feet and rested his head over the man's boot. Not out of submission. Out of something else. Connection. Caleb placed a hand gently on the dog's shoulder. Whatever they wanted you for, he whispered, they didn't finish the job. The next morning brought overcast skies and a restless wind. Caleb drove into town, parking behind a laundromat near the docks. From there he entered a small, narrow bookstore that had a hidden staircase in the back, one that led to the office of Abigail Quinn, a woman he hadn't spoken to in years. Abigail was in her late 40s, striking in a severe sort of way. She was tall, lean, and always impeccably dressed, today in a gray pantsuit with a blue scarf knotted tightly around her neck. Her dark brown hair was pulled into a bun, and her thin-framed glasses balanced perfectly on a nose that had once been broken in a self-defense class gone wrong. Abigail had been a civilian liaison for naval intelligence before retiring early after exposing a corruption scandal no one thanked her for. Since then, she had operated quietly, helping veterans and insiders who needed favors outside official channels. She didn't greet Caleb with surprise when he stepped into her office. Just raised one eyebrow. "You look like hell," she said flatly. "You're still terrifying," he replied. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Let me guess. You found something you weren't supposed to." "I need a file scrub," Caleb said, sliding a USB across the desk. "Military program. Code name, Shadow Recon. Dog unit. Asset M4. She took the drive, turned it over once in her fingers, and plugged it into a heavily modified laptop. She frowned as the screen lit up. "Where'd you get this access?" Old doors. I knew where to knock. She scrolled silently, occasionally making low noises of disapproval. Then she stopped. Asset M4 wasn't meant to return. Caleb sat forward. Why? Abigail tapped the screen. This mission Alpha Greyline. It wasn't a recon op. It was a kill switch test. They deployed M4 offshore with no extraction protocol. Designed to see how long he could last. How far he could track a beacon across open water. Think about that. They sent him out to die. Why? Caleb asked again. They were prepping the next generation of autonomous trackers, Abigail said. Dogs that wouldn't need handlers at all. But there were complaints. Something about too much independence. Behavioral shifts. Like the dogs were learning. Caleb clenched his jaw. And when they started to think for themselves, they got written off. Abigail looked at him, suddenly softer. Caleb, they buried this because it worked. But it scared them. He stood. Thanks. She nodded. Watch your six. He walked out without looking back. The forest around Caleb's cabin had always offered him peace, a cathedral of pine and cypress where the wind whispered in ancient tongues and the canopy muted the harshness of the world. But that morning, the silence felt wrong, too still, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Shadow sensed it first. He had been lying on the porch, head on his paws, watching the woods with that stoic intensity that had become part of his nature. But then he rose slowly, nose twitching, ears tilting toward the gravel road beyond the tree line. Caleb followed his gaze and stood. He didn't hear it at first. Then came the faint crunch of tires over gravel. A matte black SUV emerged through the mist, its windows tinted too dark for state-issued vehicles, and its license plate noticeably absent. It rolled forward with eerie precision and stopped just before the edge of the clearing. Caleb narrowed his eyes, fingers curling slightly at his sides. Shadow hadn't moved from his stance, tail stiff, legs locked, waiting for a signal. Two men stepped out of the SUV. Both wore plain clothes, dark jeans, tactical boots, and fitted jackets. The one on the left was tall, clean-cut, with a shaved head and a sharp jawline. His movements were crisp, practiced. The other, shorter and broader, wore a baseball cap and kept glancing toward the trees, his body language more restless, like a man used to operating in tighter, more dangerous quarters. Neither of them carried visible weapons, but Caleb had spent enough years around operators to know they were armed nonetheless. The taller man raised a hand in a casual wave and walked forward alone. "Morning," he said with an accent that didn't belong anywhere in Georgia. "You Caleb Dawson?" Caleb didn't answer. "We're looking for a dog," the man continued. "German Shepherd. Large, black and tan, no collar. Could be injured. Reports say someone found him near the marsh." Caleb kept his expression neutral. "Lot of dogs near the marsh." The man smiled tightly. "This one's special. We just want to take him back. That's all." Caleb stepped off the porch, not closing the door behind him. "If the dog's yours, you should have chipped him." The man's smile didn't fade. "He's part of a government program. Unfinished business." At that, Caleb's patience snapped like a dry twig. "He's not your business anymore." The second man stepped forward slightly, eyes narrowing, but the taller man raised a hand to halt him. "We don't want trouble." "You brought trouble," Caleb said. "Now turn around and leave." There was a beat of silence. The men didn't move. Shadow growled low from behind Caleb, the sound barely audible but charged with warning. The tall man glanced past Caleb toward the door, eyes narrowing just a touch. "Suit yourself," he said. "But someone's going to come for him, sooner or later. And they won't ask nicely." They turned and walked back to the SUV, climbed in, and drove off, slowly, like they wanted to make sure Caleb knew they'd return. Caleb stood there for a long moment, listening to the sound of the engine fade into the trees. Then he stepped back into the cabin, shut the door, and locked it. Shadow stood by the window, ears still alert. "We're leaving," Caleb said quietly. He grabbed the go bag he kept stashed under the floorboards, an old military duffel filled with essentials: water, dried food, a burner phone, a pistol, a first aid kit, a coil of rope, a flare gun, and 3 stacks of cash in different currencies. He had packed it years ago after saying no to something he couldn't live with, and now, for the first time, he was glad he had. As he moved, Shadow followed him silently, his steps soft and calculated. Caleb opened the back hatch of the cabin that led into the trees. It had once been used to access his deer blind, but now it served another purpose. He took them through a narrow trail that weaved behind thick brush and down into a dry creek bed, overgrown with ferns and fallen branches. They walked for half a mile before reaching a rusting ATV hidden beneath a camouflage tarp. Caleb pulled the tarp away and checked the fuel tank. Full. Shadow leapt into the back cargo section without prompting. As the engine roared to life and they sped into the woods, memories returned like jagged shards from a life Caleb had tried to forget. He remembered a base overseas. Not desert. Jungle. He had been approached by a commanding officer with icy eyes and no insignia, offering him a new assignment. Off books. Untraceable. Something about testing environmental endurance, obedience under chemical stress. The term biological adaptability had come up. He had said no. Twice. The second time, the officer hadn't smiled. It's not just about training dogs, he had said. It's about seeing how far we can push the mind to separate instinct from identity. That line had haunted him. Now, as he drove deeper into the forest, Caleb couldn't shake the idea that Shadow might not have just been a recon tool. He might have been part of something far worse. Something designed not to survive, but to transform. An hour later, they reached a small cabin Caleb had built long ago as a backup, a one-room shelter near a forgotten logging road. Inside, it was dusty but functional. A cot, a wood stove, a solar radio, and a generator. Shadow explored the room with quiet purpose, sniffing each corner, then settling by the stove. Caleb dropped the bag on the cot and sat beside the dog. They came asking, he said softly. But they weren't asking. They were warning. Shadow rested his head on Caleb's leg, heavy but present. The gesture was subtle, but it grounded something in Caleb he hadn't realized was drifting. They built you to obey, he said, but they forgot one thing. Survival makes its own choices. Outside, the woods remained silent. But for the first time, Caleb felt that the quiet wasn't peace. It was camouflage. By the time Caleb and Shadow reached the coast, the sky had turned slate gray, heavy with the scent of rain and salt. They had driven through back roads and overgrown paths for hours before reaching the secluded cove, an inlet hidden between two rocky cliffs, known only to locals who remembered when smugglers used it during Prohibition. Caleb had discovered the place years ago while surveying for a fishing route. He'd built a small shed here, weathered and camouflaged with driftwood and reeds, stocked with supplies in case he ever needed to vanish without a trace. Now, he and Shadow stood at the water's edge. The tide lapped gently against the rocks, and a stiff wind tugged at Caleb's jacket. Behind them, the old generator sputtered to life, giving just enough power to light the inside of the shack. Caleb sat at a crude wooden desk and pulled out a manila folder, thick with notes and smeared with the smudge of sea air. Inside was the printed file from Abigail Quinn, Asset M4. He spread the pages before him, flipping past deployment records, training logs, command directives, all fragments of a puzzle that pointed to a chilling picture. Shadow, or M4, hadn't been bred just for strength or obedience. He had been trained for deep-sea navigation, long-range tracking, and worst of all, independent operation without handler oversight. It was clear now, Shadow wasn't simply an abandoned military animal. He was an experiment, a prototype that had proven too intelligent, too aware. Shadow lay near the doorway, his body still but his eyes locked on Caleb's every movement. Rain began to tap against the tin roof, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled softly. Caleb muttered, half to himself, "They didn't just train you to follow. They trained you to decide." As he turned another page, a new sound broke the quiet. A low vibration. Faint at first, then louder. The unmistakable thrum of helicopter blades. Caleb froze. Shadow shot up, muscles taut, his ears pinned back, and his body dropped instinctively into a low crouch. His eyes didn't scan, they locked upward toward the cliff rim. The wind shifted, and Caleb saw it. A dark, fast-moving aircraft, hovering low over the waterline, no markings, doors already sliding open. "Shadow," Caleb said, voice calm but firm, "stay with me." But the dog was no longer listening. His body trembled with the force of memory, legs twitching as if pulling for muscle commands buried deep. Caleb saw the shift in his eyes, the haze of recognition coupled with a strange absence, like Shadow was somewhere else entirely. Then came the high-pitched pulse. It wasn't audible to Caleb, but he felt it in his teeth, like the hum of electronics in a dead silent room. Shadow's ears flattened. He stumbled backward, pawing at his skull, eyes now wide and glassy. On the cliff above, a figure stepped from the helicopter. Tall, lean, wearing a dark field jacket, gloved hands, and mirrored sunglasses. His face was older now, lined but not soft. His name wasn't spoken, but Shadow knew it. Caleb saw it in the way the dog froze mid-breath, eyes locked on the man like prey recognizing its hunter. The man raised a device, small, metal, palm-sized, and pressed a button. Another pulse. Shadow dropped, his limbs folding beneath him like marionette strings had been cut. He whimpered, just once, low and guttural. Caleb was at his side in 2 strides, one hand on the dog's shoulder. "Hey! Stay with me. Look at me, Shadow." The shepherd trembled, eyes darting between Caleb and the figure above. Then something shifted. The man on the cliff made a gesture, 2 fingers, palm down, lowered in a quick, commanding motion. Shadow began to move. He started to rise, chest low, legs coiled, body aligning into a position Caleb knew too well, an assault posture. "No," Caleb said sharply. "That's not who you are anymore." For a second, Shadow hesitated. His body locked in that dangerous in-between space, obedience and resistance, loyalty and memory. Caleb knelt in front of him, placing both hands gently on the dog's face. "You are not his weapon. You are not his experiment. You choose now. Not them." Above, the figure stepped closer to the edge. He lowered his sunglasses. Caleb saw the man's face clearly for the first time. His name was Major Lucan Ridge, a former special tactics handler with the Navy's disavowed Black Signal Division. He had trained dogs like Shadow, intelligent, loyal, and disposable. Caleb had met him once during an interdivision briefing. He remembered Ridge's voice, how he spoke about operational value, the way others spoke about ammunition. Now Ridge pointed directly at Shadow and shouted something Caleb couldn't hear. Shadow flinched. Then he stood. Caleb felt his heart stop. Shadow turned, not toward the cliff, but toward Caleb. His tail twitched. His stance widened, not for attack, but for protection. And then he growled. It was not the growl of fear. It was defiance. Above, Ridge pressed the device again, but nothing happened. Shadow remained standing. He stepped in front of Caleb, placing himself between the man and the descending helicopter. A second figure appeared behind Ridge, this one-armed. They began rappelling down. Caleb stood quickly, pulling the flare gun from his bag and aiming it skyward. "Run," he shouted. But Shadow didn't budge. Caleb fired the flare into the air. The red light arced up, brilliant against the gray sky. It bought them seconds, maybe minutes. Shadow barked once, sharp and loud. It echoed across the cove. The dog lunged, not at the cliff, but to the side trail leading away from the cove's mouth. Caleb followed. They sprinted through the rocky trail, past mangroves and drift logs, Caleb pushing his body to keep up with the sheer, effortless speed of Shadow, who now moved with purpose, guided not by commands, but instinct sharpened by memory. They didn't stop until the forest swallowed them whole again. The wind screamed across the rocky bluff as Caleb and Shadow emerged from the tree line onto the exposed cliff edge. The cove below was hidden now, swallowed by mist and distance, but the sound of rotor blades echoed through the overcast sky, thumping like a war drum closing in. Caleb scanned the terrain with the sharpness of an old soldier. The terrain was treacherous, rocks layered like broken glass, patches of wet moss, and a steep drop behind them that led to crashing waves below. But it was the only place they could make a stand. They were out of forest, out of places to run. Shadow was crouched low beside him, eyes locked on the ascending figures making their way up the narrow switchback trail from the cove. Black-clad operatives moving in two-man formations, their boots silent, their movements methodical. 4 of them, maybe more in reserve. One carried a suppressed rifle slung across his chest, the others sidearms and standard tactical vests. The lead man, tall and lanky, moved with the confidence of someone who didn't expect resistance. Caleb reached into his duffel and pulled free a flare pistol, his last flare already spent, but the weapon was heavy and durable. Not meant to kill, just enough to burn, blind, disorient. The wind shifted again. Above, the helicopter returned, now hovering lower, its rotors slicing the air with mechanical rage. And standing just at the door, gripping a metal bar, was Major Lucan Ridge. Caleb saw his face clearly this time. Ridge was clean-shaven, square-jawed, his military-cut hair untouched by the passing years. He wore tactical black, but not a uniform, just enough structure to suggest authority without offering affiliation. He wasn't here as a soldier. He was here as the architect of a program that had gone too far. The lead operative called out over the roar of the chopper, his voice amplified by a shoulder mic, "Turn over the dog. You have 5 seconds." Caleb stepped forward, just enough to be seen. "You don't give orders here. You don't understand what that dog is." Ridge's voice boomed through a speaker on the helicopter. "He's not yours to protect. He's not yours to command." Ridge raised the device again, the ultrasonic transmitter. Shadow stiffened beside Caleb, his body locking up for a heartbeat. But Caleb dropped to one knee, placing a hand on Shadow's chest. "You're here. Not with them. You choose." The whine began. Shadow trembled, but this time his ears didn't fold. His eyes didn't lose focus. Then he moved. Without a sound, Shadow lunged forward, rushing the lead operative on the trail. The man barely had time to react before 80 pounds of muscle slammed into his torso, sending him sprawling across the rocks. His weapon clattered down the slope. Shadow stood over him, teeth bared, growling low enough to shake the ground beneath his victim's ribs. The second operative aimed his pistol, but Caleb was already moving. He hurled the empty flare gun at the man's wrist, striking it hard enough to throw off the shot. Then he closed the distance, tackling the agent with the momentum of fury and years of training. They went down hard, fists landing in wild rhythm, boots scrabbling for leverage. Caleb caught a blow to the ribs, but retaliated with an elbow to the throat. The man choked, rolled, then fled down the path, calling for backup. The remaining 2 hesitated. The wind howled louder. From the helicopter, Ridge barked one final command. "M4, return to handler. Stand down." Shadow turned. His body stiffened for a moment, as though the old training surged forward like a wave. But then he barked. Loud, raw, defiant. One single bark that cut through the rotor noise, the command, the manipulation. And then he stepped toward Caleb and sat beside him. "No," Caleb said aloud, facing the helicopter. "He's not a weapon. He's not your prototype. He's a survivor. And you lost him the moment you left him to die." The chopper hovered for another beat. Then Ridge lowered the transmitter. A pause. An unspoken calculation. And then he gave a curt signal. The remaining operatives retreated, pulling their fallen comrade from the rocks. The helicopter rose, turning away from the bluff. Within seconds, they were gone, leaving only swirling air and the weight of a moment that would not be undone. Caleb and Shadow stood alone on the cliff. Rain began to fall. Soft at first, then heavier, washing away the scuffs in the dirt and the blood on Caleb's knuckles. Shadow looked up, blinking as the drops streaked down his muzzle. Caleb knelt beside him. "You did it," he said quietly. "You made your choice." Shadow leaned forward, pressing his forehead to Caleb's shoulder. It wasn't an act of obedience. It was solidarity. A pact forged not in programming, but in freedom. 7 days had passed since the confrontation on the cliff, and the coastal winds that once carried the sound of rotors and gunfire now whispered only of sea salt and renewal. Caleb Dawson, his weather-beaten hands no longer trembling from adrenaline, sat on the porch of a small, cedarwood cabin nestled just beyond the dunes of Tybee Island. Unlike his former place hidden in the woods, this cabin faced the Atlantic head-on. Sunlight bathed the beach in a golden glow each morning, while the ocean sang lullabies at night, soothing the wounds both visible and hidden. The cabin itself was humble, built decades earlier by fishermen long gone. Caleb had bought it under a different name, registered in a different state. He made no announcements, no calls. He simply arrived with Shadow, rebuilt a screen door, patched up the front steps, and found a rhythm to life that no longer included scanning the sky for threats. Shadow had changed too. In just 1 week, the German shepherd, once defined by silence and rigid military posture, had begun to show glimmers of a different soul. His coat, once matted and dulled by salt water and trauma, had taken on a rich sheen under Caleb's careful brushing. His body remained muscular, agile, but his movements had softened. His eyes, those storm-colored orbs that once tracked every shadow like a threat, now followed butterflies across the beach and lingered curiously on the movements of neighborhood children. That morning, Caleb watched as a group of kids gathered near the dunes. A makeshift fort of driftwood and old crab traps had become their pirate ship, and Shadow, tail wagging, tongue out, was their loyal sea monster, romping in the sand with joyful growls. The oldest boy, maybe 10, wore a red bandana and carried a toy sword. He stood tall and pointed toward the ocean. "Shadow, defend the fort!" The command rang out playfully, and to Caleb's shock, Shadow obeyed, not with the precision of a soldier, but with the goofy gallop of a dog finally allowed to be young again. He barked once, circled the imaginary perimeter, then plopped onto the sand belly up, waiting for a stick to be thrown. Caleb chuckled under his breath. "You're turning soft, old boy." Later that afternoon, Caleb took Shadow into town. Tybie's main street was a mix of old-school diners, beachy souvenir shops, and a few mom-and-pop stores run by families who remembered when gas was under $1. It was at the far end, beside a weathered building with paw prints painted on the window, that Caleb stopped. Paw and Tail, the sign read. Underneath, everything for your best friend. Inside, a bell chimed as they entered. The scent of cedar shavings and peanut butter treats filled the air. Behind the counter stood a woman in her late 40s, curvy, sun-kissed skin, auburn hair tied back with a yellow scarf. Her name tag read Maggie. Her eyes, green, warm, and curious, lit up at the sight of the shepherd. "Well, aren't you just something?" she said, leaning over the counter to get a closer look. "Got the look of a hero, but the smile of a goofball." Caleb offered a polite nod. "He's had a long journey. Just thought he deserved something new." Maggie stepped around the counter. Her gait was steady, confident, though Caleb noticed a slight limp in her left leg. She saw him look. She smiled softly. "Fell off a rescue ladder in '09. Hurricane duty. Didn't stop me, just slowed me down. Now I rescue dogs instead of people." She knelt down, gently stroking Shadow's ear. "What's his name?" "Shadow," Caleb answered after a pause. "That's what I call him now." "Does he have a collar?" "Not yet." Maggie nodded, stood, and walked to a wall display. "Well, let's fix that." She ran her hand across a line of handcrafted leather collars. "What color?" Caleb glanced at Shadow, who sat dutifully beside him, but looked longingly at a bin of squeaky toys. "Black. With brass, maybe." Maggie picked out a collar, sleek, with sturdy brass fittings and a small tag already looped in place. She held it up. "Want me to stamp his name in?" Caleb hesitated. He looked at Shadow, at the long scar that ran down his side, at the memories burned into muscle and sinew. Then he nodded. "Yes. His name is Shadow. No numbers. No codes. Just that." Maggie smiled. A fresh start. The sound of the stamping machine echoed through the shop. Clink, clink, clink. It was a small thing, but when she handed him the collar, and Caleb slipped it gently around Shadow's neck, it felt like a ceremony. The final break from a past neither of them had chosen. As they left the shop, Maggie called after him. "He's lucky to have you, you know." Caleb paused at the door. He turned and gave her a rare, genuine smile. "No, I'm lucky to have him." That evening, back at the cabin, Caleb and Shadow sat side by side on the beach, watching the horizon. The collar glinted softly in the sunset. For the first time in a long time, there was no fear in the air. No urgency. Only breath. Only peace. A gull cried overhead. Shadow barked at it, wagging his tail. And Caleb laughed. The sky above Tybee Island glowed in rich hues of amber and lavender as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the sand and shimmering waves. The final warmth of daylight kissed the porch where Caleb Dawson sat, legs stretched out, a mug of coffee cradled in his weathered hands. Beside him, Shadow rested his head on Caleb's boot, his ears twitching at the distant cries of gulls, eyes half-lidded in contentment. The golden rays reflected off the brass tag on his new collar. Shadow. No longer a code, no longer an asset, just a name. The breeze was light, salty, and soft, the kind that whispered rather than howled. It carried the sounds of laughter from further down the shore, children still building castles and chasing foam at the water's edge. Caleb tilted his head and watched the tide. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar threading through his chest, peace, gentle and strange. Inside the cabin, the world was quiet. No buzzing electronics, no gunmetal safes hidden beneath floorboards. Caleb had stripped it of any trace of paranoia. The cabin was decorated in earth tones, mismatched furniture, and an old bookshelf filled with naval thrillers, dog training manuals, and a few water-damaged photo albums. Shadow stirred. The German shepherd, now full-bodied with muscle and glossy fur, stood stretched with a groan, then gently nudged Caleb's elbow with his snout. Caleb smiled and rubbed the spot between Shadow's ears, the same place that always calmed him. "You hungry, boy?" Shadow let out a low, satisfied huff but didn't move. He wasn't restless anymore. Not since they'd both begun to sleep through the night. Caleb reached for the small wooden table beside the screen door. A yellow envelope sat waiting, its edges dog-eared, its seal untouched until now. He'd been carrying it in his jacket pocket for days, rewriting the words in his head each night, but never quite putting them to paper. Now he opened it and unfolded a single page of lined notebook paper. He began to write. "To whom it may concern at the Department of Naval Research," he wrote, the letters large and steady. "I found a survivor in the ocean. Not just any survivor, your dog, your asset, your ghost. His name, as you knew it, was Asset M4. But that's no longer who he is. His name is Shadow now." He paused, the pen hovering over the page. Shadow glanced up at him briefly, then returned to watching the horizon. "He was meant to be a tool," Caleb continued. "A weapon in the shape of loyalty. But something inside him chose otherwise. When ordered to return, he stayed. When faced with the ghost of his past, he chose to protect rather than obey. You might think that he's malfunctioned. I believe he's healed." Outside, the light continued to fade. The porch creaked softly beneath their weight, the wood warming under the touch of dusk. "I'm not asking for permission," he wrote, "and I'm not returning him. Shadow is no longer military property. He is not a statistic, a cost, or an unfinished mission. He is a survivor, and he has earned the right to choose his own path." He signed the letter with a simple flourish, Caleb Dawson, and folded it neatly. He slid it into a new envelope, sealed it, and addressed it with the same handwriting he once used on field reports and after-action memos. The address was familiar, a building tucked behind government glass and guarded gates in Washington, D.C. He knew they'd read it. He wasn't sure they'd care. That night, after dinner, grilled fish for Caleb, kibble with leftover chicken for Shadow, they walked along the shore. Caleb wore his old boots, soles worn thin from years of storms and miles, and Shadow trotted beside him, unburdened and unhurried. The waves lapped at their feet, and every now and then, Shadow would dart ahead, barking at the surf like a pup discovering the world for the first time. Further down the beach, a young woman with a red frisbee approached. Her name was Harper, a marine biologist in her early 30s, visiting for a short-term coral mapping project. She was petite, with dark blonde curls pulled into a tight bun and a laugh that cracked like sunlight through clouds. She bent down with a smile and held out the frisbee. "Think your boy wants a go?" Caleb nodded, a smirk playing on his lips. "You can try." He's picky. She threw it. Shadow's ears perked, and then in a flurry of sand and muscle, he took off. He returned moments later, tail wagging proudly, frisbee clamped between his teeth. Harper grinned. Oh, he's a natural. Caleb laughed. He's learning how to play. It's new for both of us. They talked for a while, nothing deep, just easy banter about tide patterns, favorite books, and which diner had the best pie. When Harper finally waved goodbye, Caleb watched her silhouette disappear into the glow of street lamps. Shadow bumped his shoulder against Caleb's leg, as if approving. Back at the cabin, with the moon now high and the ocean a quilt of dark silk, Caleb hung a small sign above the door. He carved it himself from driftwood he'd found near the old lighthouse. It read, "Home," and beneath it, smaller in the same hand, Caleb and Shadow. They went inside. Shadow curled beside the hearth, one paw tucked under his chest. Caleb sat by the window, letter resting on the table, the ocean beyond rippling under stars. Tomorrow, he'd drive into town, find a mailbox, and send the letter. But tonight, he just watched his dog sleep and listened to the waves, grateful, not for the past they'd survived, but for the future that was now fully theirs. Shadow's journey is not just a story about a dog rescued from the ocean, but a living testament that miracles can happen in our everyday lives, if we listen, open our hearts, and trust God's guidance. A creature who seemed born to fight and obey eventually finds freedom, love, and a family not through orders, but through love. Caleb lost everything: his wife, his children, and his belief in good things. But then, a soul who seemed abandoned pulled him back to the light. That's how God works, silently but powerfully, not in thunder or fire, but through the eyes of a wounded dog, through patience, and through the choice to forgive, not to retaliate. If you believe that every life deserves love, if you believe that God can use what seems broken to heal us, please leave an amen in the comments as a prayer for all those who are lost to find the light. Share this story if you believe that love, even when it comes late, can always save a life. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue to accompany inspiring stories like this. God always sees sincere hearts. May He bless you and your family today.